we begin perhaps with just a couple of questions that have come up in the Q&A, if that's all right? So one of the questions was about the fact that somebody that was in the FLARE study, there were 4 different arms they could have been involved in, and they were just wondering, is there always a 25% chance of being in one arm? And I will ask a slightly extra question, which is, might sometimes that change during a trial?
I mean, flare's been around for a long time now, and it's pretty much closed. There were 4 treatment arms. There was ibrutinib, rituximab, ibrutinib, FCR, and I plus V. So, and then over time, it sort of morphed so that the ibrutinib and rituximab arm, I don't think we continued with that, and so it became single agent ibrutinib. So then there were 3 arms, and so in essence there was a sort of a 75% chance that you'd have a non-chemotherapy approach, but it would be 1 to 1 to 1 from memory, okay, and then it would have changed so that there were 3 arms. The questions we ask, of course, are slightly different. So trying to compare the FCR with I plus V, or looking at questions around minimal residual disease or minimal detectable disease, and measurable disease. So those are important questions about the quality of remission and what that means. So, to our knowledge, FCR has been a super treatment in CLL. It was absolutely amazing, and blew everything out of the water at the time. And it was a really hard ask to knock it off its perch. So some of the key questions around that have been related to the toxicity, the side effects, and as well as long-term benefits. So we know that FCR can have long-term benefits for many people who have had it. There are many people who've had FCR and not needed to go on with anything else. So the idea behind the FLARE study is to really look at the nature of remission, and it's almost independent of what treatment arm people went into.
And I suppose the question was really, is this always 25, 25, 25, 25? I know I was looking at one clinical trial recently where partway through it, they actually changed the ratios because they could see how well the new treatment was working. So it can move, can't it, as you go through a trial?
Yes,
anyway, that was one question that was raised.
Okay.
I think one of the areas you all wanted to talk about was about the whole question of quality of life and side effects. I mean, John, do you want to say anything about that?
What does quality of life mean to you, John, and how important is that?
We've only got another half an hour, Ben. Quality of life is key. I mean, CLL is a condition that, by and large, we can live with. However, we are exposed to increased infection risk, and we can. There you go. We can find ourselves in situations during treatment when the side effects are harder to deal with. Now, thankfully, the current treatment regimes are probably more tolerable than the old FCR. And I just have in my own memory of the medication that you have, and then you have the medication to counter the side effects of the medication you're taking. And nowadays, apart from maybe the ramp up on venetoclax, that level of counter medication is reduced significantly. But quality of life basically allows people to be able to do what they choose to do and not have the burden of the disease, both mentally and physically. Okay, because we're involved in CLL support, we're reminded of our disease on a daily basis. But during remission, if you're not undergoing any treatment and you're in remission, you can have a reasonably normal life, provided you remain infection-free. So quality of life and the definition of quality of life can probably vary depending on what part of the whole cycle you're on.
Okay, so is there a trade-off between quality and quantity of life within the study? Just for example, if we're talking about an endpoint to get the level of CLL right down to levels that we really can't measure it. It might well be there, but we can't measure it using the current techniques, what we call MRD undetectable, for example. We know that in many cases, that will prolong the period of the duration of the remission, which means it delays some other next treatment. So it might be harder work to get there, and that may affect quality of life. But is that balanced out by improved quality of life because you defer the next line of treatment, which may come with its own set of side effects? I'm asking this question because we don't know. We don't have the answer to that. But that's where, it's one of such an important question in CLL at the moment.
Yeah, and even Ben, from a patient perspective, I would answer that with the benefit of hindsight. I know some treatments that I've undertaken had an impact on quality of life, and really, in the end, didn't make a huge amount of difference. If a treatment affects my hemoglobin level such that my ability to function within the norms, and our norms vary over time, then that's something which has a immediate physical impact on me. And I know that over the period that I've had CLL, that the definition of minimal residual disease has improved by virtue of the fact that we can now detect to a finer level than we did 20 years ago. And therefore, that's where the debate moves on. And it's relative to where we are. So, being able to do the normal things if access to a trial allows us to be able to get to a point where our normal way of life that we all have a desire to be able to undertake is improved, well, then that's good.
Okay, I think that's a really important point. Something else, because there are specifics and individual things as well as sort of a global risk and benefit. So perhaps in the design of a study, we really need good guidance from participant representatives, to help set where the bar is in terms of risk and benefit. But when it comes to an individual, we each of us have our own risk barometer. And I often say to my patients, listen, tell me where does it lie with you? What would you find acceptable and what would you find unacceptable? So when it comes to somebody actually looking at individually at a study, they might find that it fits very well with them and very acceptable, or they may say, actually, this isn't for me, because people do differ. So I think there's a difference between the individual response going into a study as a participant and the overall design, and making that balance as good as we can get it. So just a point on that.
And very much around the patient deciding, and their partner or supporter deciding what matters most to them, which might not be the average at all. I mean, this is a heterogeneous condition, but also everybody's reaction to it is different. So you've got a multi-complicated set of matrices, if you like, trying to work out where do I fit into this and what's the best area. I mean, one of the other big areas which affects trials as well as other forms of treatment is around the whole question of, do you have a fixed term medication, or do you have medication that continues for a time? And this again is changing, isn't it, as we go along?
I think it's such an interesting and valuable conversation to have with people. As I said before, we do have some time when we're discussing this, but it's so important that there is an open discussion about the the priorities that someone might have. So you mentioned fixed duration versus an ongoing treatment. And it might be that the key thing would be, well, I want to start something now, today. I want to just take a tablet. I want to do something that's straightforward. Um, and I don't mind still being on that treatment in a few years' time if it's easy and suits me. Some other people will say, I don't want to be on treatment forever. I'd rather have as short as treatment as I can. And I don't mind traveling. And I understand that drugs like venetoclax come with their own complications in terms of the initial monitoring for this thing called tumor lysis, looking out for kidney function, for example. And that's all a bit fiddly in the first few weeks of treatment, but then it settles down. And at the end of the 12 to 15-month period, you can come off the treatment again. And for some people, that's really very attractive. And then we have a conversation about, well, is it right biologically? So we start thinking about the nuances of it as well and put that into the frame in terms of, are you more likely to do well with this treatment or that treatment statistically? Now, statistics never really apply to the single individual, as we know. So what it often boils down to is that preference and priorities and the discussion, weighing it all up and having that open conversation. So real world treatment choices and clinical trial treatment choices are often the same, except with a clinical trial, you've got the PIS and it's one size fits all. In the real world,
Yeah.
there's often a bit more nuance. And I think sometimes it's worthwhile bringing that subtlety and the openness and the listening part of it into the clinical trial process. Not, here's a clinical trial for you, here's the information, here's the consent form.
Yeah.
It's not as
And,
simple.
and also tolerability,
Mm,
I think is a critical point. And it harks back to your question about quality of life. I mean, the more tolerable any medication is, and the less impact of side effects,
hmm
then it, it's an avenue that will get a huge vote, a vox pop vote, from the people that are there. And okay, I would say that I have benefited from research because the medication recently that I've had when I was initially diagnosed was the thing of dreams. And it was, so in terms of the benefits of research, even in my short experience in real terms, it has had a profound effect in terms of treatment choice and side effect reductions and also improvement in quality of life. And as such, I will always be an advocate for research and trials.
And you were saying earlier on that one of the benefits of being on a trial is that you have a very structured process, if you like, and people are looking at you very carefully. And there's a comment in the Q&A from somebody who was saying that at an early test before they went on a trial, something else was identified, which meant that they could then go on to treatment earlier than they'd anticipated. So if you like, that extra thoroughness of the trial process helped them. And I think one of the other things that are important with trials is getting regular updates. So
hmm
how does that work, Ben? I mean, both individually, but also about the trial as a whole. Will people tend to get updates?
Sure. I think the first one about picking things up, I think it was somebody said they'd been enrolled in the Oxblood study, and so there was sort of extra tests and samples and things taken. So that's a really good example of a tangible benefit for being on the study. There may be other benefits, the psychological benefit, the template, everything else, which means that it's predictable. There are downsides as well. So occasionally you go into a trial, you have more blood tests, more scans, more bone marrow tests. So you need to be aware of that going into a study. So the question is about how is data shared? And I think, as I mentioned, I think this is really a work in progress. I don't think we're that good at sharing the information about, in plain English, putting in summaries and sharing that regularly. Now, it does happen, for example, in the CLL UK CLL Forum website. There are often summaries of clinical trials there. Clinical trials are typically published in abstract form, in other words, a summary, but a technically data-filled summary put into a scientific clinical conference and presented by um, one of the investigators with all the background and data presented at the meeting so that it can be peer reviewed in the conference and then a scientific paper produced, which is given to a number of reviewers to pick it apart and make sure that it's basically been done properly and that it is trustworthy. And then at an individual level, when people come to me in the clinic, they say, how are things getting on? Now, I don't always have that data because I'm waiting for something to come through. So, for example, there may be people on the call as part of static. Um, Static is fairly recent, so we haven't really got the answers for static just yet. So, there's the expectation that there's going to be feedback on something which might take more than a year or two to come back to us before we can talk about it in a clinic.
I'm just going to say, as a patient, that is a frustration when it comes to trials. It really is, and I understand why there is that time scale. I understand that they may have to go to an international conference to tell their story and have the peer review. But I have to say, from a patient perspective, that is a frustration
Mm,
because, we've signed up to it, we've given our time, and one of the paybacks, apart from any physical benefit, is the information flow back the way. And sometimes the trials websites are good at not saying an awful lot.
In defence, well, not in defence, as a very big positive on the static trial. So some of us from CLL support are actually on the trial management group. And there's now a public website with
Yeah.
information about the static trial. And at least it says what there is that's knowable. I mean, not if it's not knowable, but at least you can look at what is knowable.
mm,
Now, Ben, one of the other things I want to ask you about is if you're being treated by outside a trial, your
mm.
clinician presumably may have some opportunity to change the dose size according to your particular circumstances, dare I say it, your BMI or whatever.
Yep.
And certainly when people were on FCR, that was very much measured, I believe. But
Hmm.
if we're on trials now for CLL, it sounds as though the amount of treatment you have to have is fixed on the trial, regardless of the person. Is that right? Or
I think there's the eligibility, which you cannot change. So John was talking about physicians' discretion
yeah,
to shoehorn someone into a trial because you really want them to be there, and the patient wants to be in the study. So that's slightly different from the dosage. So quite commonly in clinical trials, we'll have guidance about this. So there'll be how do we respond to changes, whether it's a dosage schedule and level. So, for example, if someone is on a study receiving a certain treatment and the platelet count drops, or if the neutrophil count drops, um, then often they'll be, okay, well, let's see how it goes, hold off the drug for a short period of time, or reduce the dose. And then when it goes back up to normal, go back to the dose. So there is some built-in flexibility. And you can often do that several times within the structure of the study, and there are often dose levels. So you can de-escalate down within certain dose levels, but it is reasonably rigid. There's a template for it. And then if it keeps happening despite those maneuvers, then it may well be that it's trying to tell us something that actually that particular person shouldn't be on that treatment. So they then come off the trial. So there is a degree of flexibility, but it's codified. It's anticipated based on the understanding and knowledge that we have of the current side effect profile, particularly in relation to infections or blood counts. So there is flexibility there. It's built in.
I suppose the other benefit of being on a trial is because it's even more structured, you're probably better placed to share side effects and to talk about them. Are you asked about, do you think, or do you think it's still up to patients to take the responsibility? What do you think, John?
It's certainly up to patients to take on the responsibility, and it's a standard question. How are you? And it's your opportunity to say. And if you're keeping a treatment diary, even a trials diary yourself, you will have those aid memoirs to be able to bring that up. What do you think, Ben?
Okay, so I think having a standardized treatment can often be really helpful here. So you know that if you're being treated in London, Leicester, Oxford, Newcastle, Liverpool, wherever you're having your therapy, it's going to be the same. And so your side effect profile, the sort of types of problems that you might get, are going to be comparable with other groups of people, so that as clinicians, we can share that information and compare groups. And it's not as arbitrary as it otherwise would be when people might be having different doses in different regimes if they were not on a study. So I think it really helps us to standardize treatment, and therefore helps us to talk and communicate about risks and side effects in a much more effective.
What is really important, therefore, is that the patients give you the data about the side effects and share them all. Otherwise, you won't have all that information from their perspective, will you?
Do you think people are frightened or fearful of sharing their side effects with us as investigators? Because I think it can sometimes feel like a two-edged sword, that we want to understand what's going on, but could there be a worry, and I'm in listening mode here, could there be a worry that if someone were to tell me that they've got XYZ problem, that I might stop their treatment or pull them out of the study? So where is the balance in that, do you think, from a
John,
participant point of view?
Well, I think we have an obligation to be open and honest. And if a side effect is so significant, then I think it's very hard to hide that side effect, to be honest with you. And if it has an impact that would result in us coming out of a trial, well, it's for our own good. So, that's where openness and honesty and understanding the whole process is inbuilt into our consent giving at the very start. And we understand that there may be, it is not a straight journey. There are lots of junctions on the motorway journey plan that we have, which may cause us to be, taken off it. But yeah, I think it is intrinsic to our whole participation in it that we're open and honest.
Okay, John, I think you're right that there are strict boundaries around it, but there are often, from a clinical point of view, there are often mitigating factors. So it could be that, there's a problem with kidney function or liver function or blood count that might be related to some other factor. It could be a grumbling infection of some kind. It could be a dietary thing. It could be not enough fluid, or there could be other things going on. And I think sometimes there is space and scope to optimize, to make things as good as they possibly can be, to reduce those side effects. So I'm really encouraged to hear that people would be very open about side effects, and that's my experience. I don't have any different experience from that. I think
we would certainly encourage them to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you can often help.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a trial, isn't it? It's trying to work out. And you were talking before about standard of care.
Yeah.
And what the trial is trying to do is improve the standard of care and certainly not be worse than the existing one. But we need to know, is it working for everybody, or does it not suit particular groups or whatever? And I think the thing with treatments for CLL is just whether you're on a trial or not, the treatments are now just so much more effective than they were 10, 15, 20 years ago, whatever, that the outlook is enormously more positive. Even if you want to be on a trial and can't get on it, you've still loads of good treatments for people to be having.
I think anecdotally, we've heard people on treatment out with trials, when they mention to some clinicians that they have this, that, or the other side effect, they're saying, yeah, that's one of the side effects, kind of, you know, suck it up type of thing. But on a trial, it's very important to be aware of the side effects and communicate them.
Yeah.
You're a tough guy, John.
So can you tell us, Ben, what happens if you're on a trial and you've been taking a particular treatment, and then the trial ends? Are you able to continue to access that treatment?
It entirely depends what the treatment is and what the structure of the trial is.
Okay.
So it's, you know, going back to what John said earlier, eyes wide open, that you need to know what it is. Now, there are some treatments where you have them for a fixed period of time. And a very common question in the Research Ethics Committee is, well, what next? What happens when the trial finishes? In the world of CLL, we already have fixed duration therapies. So the question of what do we do next is not necessarily the be all and end all as a problem, because we know that that particular block of therapy is going to end. What might happen next is, how do we monitor that? What are the dynamics of following that remission through? And then what rules do you build in about what do you do if and when something were to happen? So the questions arise about how frequent should we monitor? What does this MRD, undetectable state, mean? So those might be the questions about that. In terms of BTK inhibitors, for example, so ongoing therapies that don't have a limit, well, they don't have a limit. So it's unlikely that the particular drug would stop. Now, there are complicating factors there, because let's say it's a BTK inhibitor that you would normally expect to keep going, but the trial period is, for argument's sake, 6 years. I think there's potential that there would be positive results before the end of the study, which allow the regulatory authorities and the funding bodies to look at that data and to allow for it to continue as standard of care. So, of course, there are uncertainties around all of that, but at the end of the day, we actually have quite a few very good treatment options that mean that in reality, we're not really facing falling off a cliff, I think, with any of those new treatments of non-covalent BTK inhibitors, for example. So you know, there are already good alternatives that we can slot into. So again, nobody going into a study is likely to be compromised or find that things are going to be unfavorable for them. And then just to rephrase this business about overselling benefits, it's not that people going into a study don't get benefit. Jolly well hope that anyone going into a study does benefit from it. It's just that when it comes to selling the study, selling in inverted commas, providing information within the PIS, it doesn't overstate it.
Good.
But
so we've had a fascinating discussion that I'm afraid we now need to draw to a close, but we've got a question here asking about where can you find out about results of trials that have already taken place?
I'm not aware of a summary. I think there are individual, as you said, public aspects to the trial results, but there is no collective one.
I think it's a rapidly evolving area, Hilary. There are updates on clinical trials all the time. That you know, people spend a lot of their time putting those presentations together to give those overall views, but they're often broken down into different biological groups, and it's a very much a moving picture. So there isn't an overall result.
So I'm going to end by just saying an enormous thank you John, and to you, Ben, for coming along this afternoon, for having a little sparring with each other about the two different dimensions. But really, we need both, don't we? It's what you said at the beginning, Ben. You can't do trials without patients, and patients very much want the treatments available to continue to progress, and trials is the way to do that.
People who get involved in the groups that help to design these clinical studies, it's not about scientific knowledge or understanding CLL at a biological level. It's much more about helping clinicians and clinical investigators to understand the balance between risk and benefit in understanding what does tolerable mean, and what are the goals of a study reasonable. You don't have to know about MRD, you don't have to know about P53 or the molecular structure of a drug or anything like that. It can also be really helpful if not just designing patient information sheets, but proofreading them, sense checking, and ensuring that they're clear and open and say what they need to say. So it's not about understanding science. It's about helping the research process. And I don't think we can do a better job of this without that input at this stage. And it's absolutely key. And I really look forward. I think it's really exciting.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.